Chapter 1. The World of Paper and Thread. In the quiet mountain ring town of Solomon's Creek, the past was not a distant country. It was a physical presence. It lived in the worn Bibles in the church pews, in the family ledgers in the mercantile, and in the treasured volumes of poetry that were passed down through generations. And the man who mended the past, who gave it strength and structure to survive the future, was Samuel Thorne. At 70, Samuel was the town's bookbinder, a master of a quiet and fading art. His workshop, occupying the ground floor of his neat stone-fronted home, was a sanctuary of order. It smelled of old paper, of rich leather, of the sharp acidic tang of bookbinder's glue. He was a man who had become a reflection of his craft, patient, meticulous, and profoundly quiet. His hair was the colour of silver fox, his eyes a clear focused grey that saw the world in terms of signatures, spines and end papers. His hands, though gnarled with age and stained by ink, were instruments of delicate resurrection, capable of transforming a tattered broken book into a thing of beauty and permanence. Samuel's life was a fortress built of routine. He rose at dawn, he worked until the light failed, and he spent his evenings in the silent company of his own books. He was a widower, a title he had worn for 20 long years. His wife Isabel, a woman of vibrant laughter and boundless warmth, had been the sun in his quiet universe. Her death from a sudden illness had plunged his world into a perpetual twilight. He had not crumbled. He had instead encased his grief in the same way he encased a book, binding it tightly in the hardcovers of his work and his solitude. He was a respected, almost revered figure in the town, but he was a man who kept his own story tightly shut, its pages unread. He had long ago accepted that his life was an epilogue, a quiet tending of other people's stories. He was content, or so he told himself, until a new story walked through his door. Chapter 2. The Doctor's Arrival. Dr. Eleanor Vance arrived in Solomon's Creek on the spring stagecoach, a woman in the autumn of her life seeking a quiet place to practice a simpler kind of medicine. At 67, she was a woman of quiet authority and deep, empathetic intelligence. Her hair, a warm brown streaked with elegant silver, was pinned back in a practical but soft style. Her eyes, a clear, perceptive hazel, held the weary wisdom of a person who had seen too much of human fragility. She was a widow, her husband, Dr. Eleanor Vance, having passed away 3 years prior. Alistair had been a brilliant and ambitious medical researcher, a man who chased cures in university laboratories and lecture halls. Eleanor, a gifted physician in her own right, had been his partner in life and in work. But after his death, she found herself exhausted by the relentless pursuit of grand discoveries. She yearned for a place where she could be simply a doctor, not a researcher, a place where she could treat a child's fever or set a farmer's broken arm, where she could heal people, not just study diseases. Solomon's Creek, with its aging doctor retiring, had seemed like the perfect refuge. She set up her practice in the small clinic attached to her new home, and the town quickly came to appreciate her. She had a calming presence and hands that were both gentle and sure. She listened, she cared, but like Samuel, she carried a quiet, private sorrow. She had dedicated her life to her husband's ambitions, and now alone she was faced with the daunting task of writing a final chapter for herself, with no idea how to begin. Their paths crossed out of necessity. Eleanor had inherited her husband's extensive medical library, including his private journals. One of the most important volumes, a detailed record of his research into regional fevers, had a broken spine, its pages threatening to come loose. Knowing of the town's bookbinder, she brought it to him, a simple transaction of repair. She entered his quiet, orderly workshop and found Samuel at his bench, his entire focus on a delicate piece of gold leaf tooling. He looked up, his grey eyes calm and guarded. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and gentle. "I am Dr. Vance. I was hoping you might be able to help me with this." She placed the heavy leather-bound journal on his workbench. He looked at it, then at her. It was the first time in 20 years a woman had stood in his workshop who was not a client, but a peer, a fellow professional with skilled hands and a quiet, intelligent presence. A flicker of something long dormant stirred within him. "I will see what can be done," he said, his voice a low, rough sound, unaccustomed to anything but the briefest of pleasantries. It was the first stitch in a story neither of them could have predicted. Chapter 3. The Unreadable Diagnosis. When Eleanor returned a week later, the journal was transformed. Its spine was strong, the leather conditioned the pages secure. The repair was flawless, a testament to a master's hand. As she thanked him, Samuel hesitated, something he rarely did. "Dr. Vance," he began, his gaze fixed on the book. In the process of re-sewing the signatures, some pages came loose. "I could not help but see some of what was written. My husband's research notes," she said with a sad smile. "He was a brilliant man." "Indeed," Samuel said, "but some of his notes, they were strange. Not like the clear scientific prose in the rest of the book." He opened the journal to a section near the back. The pages were filled with her husband's familiar, precise script, but interspersed were strange, almost frantic-looking drawings of what looked like magnified cells and recurring phrases like the silent fever and a poison in the water, slow and patient. "I'm afraid I don't understand it either," Eleanor admitted, a shadow crossing her face. "Alistair was working on this just before he died. He had become obsessed with a series of unexplained illnesses in a mining town in the next county. He believed it was a waterborne contagion, but he could never isolate the agent. It was the one puzzle he never solved. The mystery intrigued Samuel. It was a broken code, a puzzle of paper and ink. For the first time in years, his mind was engaged by something other than his craft. He offered to help Eleanor organize her late husband's papers under the guise of ensuring their proper preservation. It was an excuse, and they both knew it, but it was one they were both willing to accept. Their partnership began in the quiet of her study. Surrounded by stacks of Alistair's books and notes, they began their work. He with his knowledge of paper, ink, and preservation. She with her knowledge of medicine and her husband's mind. They would work for hours, a comfortable silence between them, punctuated by her explanations of medical terms and his quiet observations about the chemical composition of a particular ink. A new rhythm entered their lives. He would bring her a newly repaired book. She would send him home with a warm meal. They spoke of their pasts, of their late spouses, of the quiet, empty spaces in their lives. They were two solitary people who had found in this shared intellectual quest a profound and unexpected companionship. The walls around Samuel's heart began to show the first tiny cracks of light. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Progress. Just as their tentative friendship was taking root, a shadow fell across Solomon's Creek. It arrived in the form of a man named Silas Croft, a slick, well-dressed representative of the Argent Mining Corporation from Denver. Croft was a man who radiated confidence and promises. He held a town meeting and unveiled a grand plan. His company had done extensive geological surveys and had discovered a rich, untapped vein of silver in the mountains just upstream from the town near the site of the old, abandoned Sorrowful Peak mine. He spoke of jobs of prosperity, of a new hotel, of a railroad spur. He painted a picture of a booming modern future for the quiet, forgotten town. The town was electrified. In a place where survival often depended on the whims of the weather, the promise of steady wages and wealth was a powerful intoxicant. The town council, led by a starstruck Mayor Hemlock, was ready to sign any contract Croft put in front of them. Only Samuel and Eleanor felt a deep, cold unease. Sorrowful Peak. Eleanor said to Samuel that evening, her face pale, "That is the very area Alistair was studying. The place he believed the silent fever was coming from." They returned to the journal with a new terrifying urgency. They looked at the drawings again, at the frantic notes. A poison in the water, slow and patient. What if it's not a disease? Samuel mused, his craftsman's mind seeing a different kind of mechanism. What if it's the mountain itself? What if the silver mining all those years ago leached something into the creek? A mineral, a heavy metal. The idea was horrifying. Croft was not just proposing a new mine, he was proposing to reawaken a slumbering poison. The very prosperity he promised could be the town's death sentence. They tried to warn the mayor, presenting him with Alistair's journal. Mayor Hemlock, a good but simple man, leafed through the pages, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked from the strange drawings to the solid, reassuring contracts offered by Mr. Croft. "Eleanor Samuel," he said kindly but dismissively, "this is fascinating, but it's the rambling of a dead man. Mr. Croft has engineers, geologists. He has assured us his methods are perfectly safe. We cannot stand in the way of this town's future because of a ghost story." They were dismissed. The town, blinded by the promise of silver, was rushing headlong towards a cliff they could not see. Chapter 5. A Journey for Proof. "They need more than a dead man's words," Samuel said that night, his face grim. "They need living proof." Eleanor knew he was right. The journal mentions specific symptoms, she said, her mind racing. A slow weakening, a pallor of the skin, a tremor in the hands. The silent fever. "I have seen men with those symptoms," Samuel said quietly. "Old miners who worked at Sorrowful Peak in their youth. Everyone just thought it was the dust. Old age." "We need to prove the connection," Eleanor said. "We need to test the water. Not just here, but at the source. At the old mine itself." Their quest was clear. They had to make the dangerous 2-day journey up into the high country to the abandoned Sorrowful Peak mine. It was a journey into the heart of the mystery. It was also a journey that would irrevocably change them. Alone in the vast, silent wilderness, they relied on each other completely. He, with his quiet strength and frontier knowledge, made camp, navigated the treacherous trails, and stood watch at night. She, with her physician's knowledge, tended to his old aches, identified edible plants, and saw the world with the scientist's wonder. By the flickering light of their campfire, they shared the stories they had never told anyone else. He spoke of the suffocating guilt he felt for having survived his wife and child, of how he had used his work as a way to stop time to live in a perpetual, unchanging yesterday. She spoke of her own quiet regret, of wondering if her support of her husband's relentless ambition had robbed them of a simpler, happier life, of her fear that she had no story of her own, only a supporting role in his. Under the vast star-dusted sky, they were not the bookbinder and the doctor. They were just Samuel and Eleanor, two lonely, grieving souls who found in each other's company a profound and unexpected healing. The quiet respect they had shared had deepened into a tender, powerful affection. They reached the old mine. It was a scar on the landscape, a place of rot and decay. The water that seeped from its entrance had a strange metallic sheen. They carefully collected water and soil samples, their scientific mission a stark contrast to the growing emotional bond between them. On their journey back as they made camp for the last time, a quiet understanding passed between them. He reached across the small fire and took her hand. His hand was rough and stained, hers was smooth and gentle. They fit together perfectly. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I feel as though my entire life has been a broken book, and you are making the pages whole again." She smiled, her eyes shining in the firelight. "And I, Samuel, have spent my life reading other people's stories. You make me feel as though my own is just beginning." Chapter 6. The Town Hall Showdown. They returned to Solomon's Creek to find the town in a state of feverish excitement. Croft had brought in the first load of heavy equipment. The contracts were on the council's table, ready for the final signature at a town hall meeting that very afternoon. They raced to Eleanor's clinic. Using the simple microscope her husband had left her, they examined the water samples. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The water was teeming with microscopic glittering flecks of a heavy metal, likely lead or mercury residue from the old mining processes. The silent fever was not a fever at all. It was slow chronic poisoning. They arrived at the town hall just as Mayor Hemlock was picking up a pen to sign the final agreement. "Stop." Eleanor's voice rang out clear and commanding. All heads turned. Croft's face tightened into a sneer. "Dr. Vance. Mr. Thorne. I believe this matter is concluded." "On the contrary," Samuel said, stepping forward. "It is just beginning." What followed was not an emotional appeal, but a calm, methodical presentation of evidence. Eleanor, with the cool precision of a physician, described the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning symptoms that matched her husband's notes on the silent fever and the ailments of the town's older miners. Then Samuel set up the microscope, connecting it to a projection device Alistair had designed for his lectures. On the wall of the town hall, magnified 1,000 times, an image appeared, the water from the town's creek clear and clean. Then he switched the slide to the water from the Sorrowful Peak mine. The crowd gasped. The image was filled with the sinister, glittering particles of poison. "This, Eleanor," said, her voice quiet but resonant, "is the prosperity Mr. Croft is offering you. This is the water that will flow into your creek when he reopens that mine. It will not bring jobs. It will bring sickness. It will not bring life. It will bring a slow, silent death." The evidence was undeniable, visual, terrifying. The farmers looked at the image on the wall and imagined it in their drinking wells, in their livestock's troughs. The mothers imagined it in the cups of their children. Croft, his face pale with fury, tried to fight back. "This is trickery, pseudoscience from a dead man's journal and a provincial doctor." But the town was no longer listening to him. They were looking at the horrifying, glittering image on the wall. They were looking at the quiet, unshakable integrity on the faces of Samuel and Eleanor. A miner, one of the old men with trembling hands, stood up. "She's right," he said, his voice raspy. "My father worked that mine. He died young. His father before him too. We always called it the Sorrowful Peak for a reason. The spell was broken. The town had seen the truth. The meeting erupted not in anger at Croft, but in a surge of gratitude for the two quiet heroes who had saved them. Chapter 7. A Future Rebound. Defeated his scheme exposed Silas Croft left Solomon's Creek in disgrace. The town, awakened from its fever dream of silver, began the real work of securing its future. They worked together to clean up the contamination from the old mine, and they petitioned the territorial government, using Eleanor and Samuel's report, to declare the mountains a protected watershed. In the midst of this community rebirth, a quiet love story came into full bloom. The bookbinder's shop and the doctor's clinic became the two poles of a new shared world. Their homes, once silent sanctuaries of solitude, were now filled with quiet conversation, shared meals, and the comfortable presence of another loving heart. One evening, Samuel led Eleanor up to the small, dusty room above his workshop, the room he had prepared for a son and had kept locked for 17 years. He opened the door. "I have kept this room as a shrine to a future that was lost," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you have taught me that the future is not something to be locked away. It is something to be built." He looked at her, his grey eyes full of a love that was as steady and true as the ticking of his finest clock. "I am too old to offer you children, Eleanor, but I can offer you this, my whole heart, my whole life. Will you build a future with me?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked at this good, kind, courageous man who had mended her husband's book and had in the process mended her own soul. "Oh, Samuel," she whispered, taking his strong, stained hands in her own. "There is no story I would rather write." He drew her into his arms, and in the quiet, dusty room, meant for a future that never was, they began to build a new one, a future that was more beautiful and more precious for having taken a lifetime to arrive. The broken book was whole, the silent fever was cured, and in the heart of Solomon's Creek, two quiet lives finally beautifully began to chime as one. Thank you for joining us at the Story Nook. We believe that the most beautiful chapters are often written in the autumn of our lives, and that it is never too late to mend a broken heart or begin a new story. If this tale of courage and second chances resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. We look forward to sharing our next chapter with you.